Maya Chen never expected that fixing an old ambulance would uncover one of World War I's most incredible secrets. But when her wrench slipped and revealed a hidden compartment, everything changed. Her headlamp cutting through the darkness of the restoration barn like a lighthouse beam through fog. Oil stains from a century of neglect had seeped into the concrete floor, creating abstract patterns that reminded her of battlefields seen from above. At 19, Maya had earned a reputation for her mechanical intuition. The local newspaper had dubbed her the Whisperer after she'd brought a 1923 Rolls-Royce back from what everyone else had declared mechanical death. But this ambulance was different. This ambulance had been whispering to her for weeks. The vehicle had arrived at Henderson's Classic Restorations on a flatbed truck 3 months ago, donated by the estate of Eleanor Whitfield, a woman whose name meant nothing to most people, but whose legacy was about to shake the foundations of everything Maya thought she knew about courage, sacrifice, and the forgotten heroes of the Great War. The accompanying paperwork was sparse: a title transfer, a brief note about it being found in the barn, and a request that it be restored to honor those who served. Nothing more, nothing less. Nothing that could have prepared Maya for what she was about to discover. Sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories around vehicles from every era. A 1969 Mustang Boss 429 sat beside a pristine 1955 Thunderbird, while in the corner a 1932 Duesenberg waited patiently for its turn at resurrection. But none of them commanded the presence of the ambulance. There was something about its weathered olive-drab paint and Red Cross markings that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, as if the vehicle itself was mourning. Maya's boss, Frank Henderson, had initially been reluctant to take on the project. "Military vehicles are tricky," he'd said, running his weathered hands through his gray beard. "Lot of modifications over the years, lot of jury-rig repairs, and the emotional weight." He'd pause then, his eyes distant. "People get attached to these machines in ways they don't with regular cars. They represent something bigger than transportation." But Maya had been drawn to the ambulance from the moment she'd seen it. While Frank and his other mechanics focused on the flashier restorations, the sports cars and luxury vehicles that brought in the big money, Maya found herself staying after hours, studying the ambulance's lines, running her hands along its dented fenders, trying to understand what it was trying to tell her. The first month had been devoted to assessment and documentation. Maya had photographed every angle, cataloged every dent and scratch, measured every component. The ambulance was remarkably complete for a vehicle that was over a century old. Most of the mechanical systems were intact, though decades of neglect had taken their toll. The engine block was seized, the wiring harness had been chewed by generations of mice, and the wooden spoke wheels were cracked and warped beyond repair. But the bones were good, the frame solid, and beneath the layers of dust and rust, Maya could see the careful craftsmanship of an era when things were built to last. Strange modifications in the ambulance caught Maya's attention immediately. Small things at first: wiring that didn't match the factory specifications, mounting brackets that seemed to serve no obvious purpose, a fuel system that was far more complex than necessary for a simple Model T engine. Maya had restored dozens of vintage vehicles, and she'd developed an eye for modifications. But these weren't the typical aftermarket additions or wartime field repairs she'd expected to find. These modifications were precise, purposeful, and completely outside the normal parameters for an ambulance. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October. Maya was working alone in the barn, the steady drumming of rain on the metal roof providing a rhythmic backdrop to her work. She'd been trying to remove a stubborn bolt from the ambulance's rear axle assembly when her wrench slipped, sending her knuckles crashing into a hidden panel behind the driver's seat. The impact wasn't hard, but it was enough to cause the panel to shift slightly, revealing a seam she'd never noticed before. Maya sat up slowly, her heart beginning to race. She'd been over every inch of this vehicle multiple times. How had she missed this? With trembling fingers, she traced the edges of the panel, feeling for purchase points. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The seam was virtually invisible until you knew where to look, and the panel was held in place by a series of spring-loaded catches that were ingeniously concealed within the vehicle's existing trim pieces. The panel came away with a soft click, revealing a compartment that was approximately 18 inches square and perhaps 6 inches deep. Maya's headlamp illuminated the space, and her breath caught in her throat. The compartment wasn't empty. Inside was a leather satchel, wrapped in oiled cloth and secured with twine that had somehow survived a century of neglect. Beside it were several metal objects that Maya couldn't immediately identify, although their weight and construction suggested they were precision instruments of some kind. Maya's hands shook as she carefully lifted the satchel from its hiding place. The leather was remarkably well preserved, protected by the oiled cloth and the dry environment of the sealed compartment. The brass buckles were tarnished but intact, and stamped into the leather near the handle were initials, EMW, and a date, March 1918. She carried the satchel to her workbench, clearing away tools and parts to make space. The barn seemed to hold its breath as she carefully untied the twine and unwrapped the cloth. The satchel's buckles opened with surprising ease, revealing contents that Maya's pulse quickened. Inside were documents, dozens of them, wrapped in individual oiled cloth packets, maps, correspondence, what appeared to be technical drawings, and photographs. So many photographs. The first document Maya examined was a letter, written in a careful feminine hand on paper that bore the letterhead of the American Red Cross Ambulance Service. The ink had faded to a warm brown, but the words were still clearly legible. It was dated March 15, 1918, and addressed to "My dearest James." Maya read with growing amazement as the letter detailed not just the writer's work as an ambulance driver, but also her involvement in something the letter referred to only as the operation. There were references to packages being transported, to friends behind the lines, and to the necessity of maintaining absolute secrecy. But it was the photographs that truly took Maya's breath away. Black and white images, some formal portraits, others candid shots that appeared to have been taken in field conditions. Maya recognized the ambulance immediately in several of the photos, though it was clearly in its prime, gleaming and new. And standing beside it, often in the driver's seat, sometimes in the company of other drivers, was a young woman whose intelligent eyes seemed to look directly at Maya across a century of time. The woman was petite, but carried herself with unmistakable confidence. She wore the standard ambulance driver's uniform, practical boots, khaki trousers, and a shirt that was clearly tailored for movement rather than fashion. Her dark hair was pinned back severely, but a few rebellious strands had escaped to frame her face. In one photograph, she was covered in mud and what appeared to be blood, her face grim but determined. In another, she was laughing with a group of other drivers, her head thrown back in obvious joy despite the wartime setting. Maya found herself staring at the photographs for what felt like hours, trying to reconcile the young woman's apparent youth with the weight of responsibility that seemed to surround her. The woman couldn't have been much older than Maya herself, yet the eyes that stared back from the photographs held a gravity that spoke of experiences no teenager should have to endure. The letters, and there were dozens of them, painted a portrait of a young woman who had been involved in something far beyond the typical duties of an ambulance driver. There were references to coded messages, to carefully planned routes that avoided both enemy forces and official Allied checkpoints, and to a network of individuals whose identities were protected by an elaborate system of code names and false identities. The technical drawings were perhaps even more intriguing. Maya's mechanical background allowed her to interpret much of what she was seeing, and what she saw amazed her. The modifications to the ambulance had been far more extensive than she had initially realized. Hidden compartments throughout the vehicle, a secondary fuel system that could be activated by a concealed switch, and what appeared to be armor plating disguised as standard body panels.
This wasn't just an ambulance. It was a vehicle designed for covert operations in hostile territory. But it was the final document in the satchel that truly left Maya speechless. It was an official commendation signed by multiple high-ranking Allied officers and dated November 11, 1918, Armistice Day. The commendation was addressed to driver E.M. Whitfield and detailed her extraordinary service in what was described as Operation Nightingale, a covert rescue operation that had saved the lives of more than 200 Allied prisoners of war who had been slated for execution by retreating German forces. The woman who had donated the ambulance was not some distant heir disposing of a family relic. This story gets even more incredible. If you're finding it as fascinating as we are, please hit that like button and share this video with someone who loves amazing true stories. Your support helps us bring more amazing stories like Eleanor's to light. She was the driver herself, the young woman in the photographs, the hero's story that had been hidden away for over a century. And now, through pure chance and a slipped wrench, Maya had uncovered one of the most extraordinary untold stories of the Great War. The rain continued to drum against the barn roof as Maya carefully repacked the documents, her mind already racing with questions. Why had Eleanor Whitfield hidden this story? Why had such an extraordinary tale of heroism remained secret for so long? And what had happened to the woman who had risked everything to save the lives of strangers in a foreign land? As Maya sealed the compartment and cleaned up her workspace, she knew that her life had just taken a dramatic turn. Before we continue with what happens next, if you're enjoying this incredible true story of discovery and hidden heroism, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who loves history. Your support helps us bring more amazing stories like Eleanor's to light. The whispers she'd been hearing from the old vehicle suddenly made perfect sense. She was no longer just restoring an old ambulance. She was the keeper of a secret that could rewrite history books and honor a forgotten hero whose courage had been buried for too long. The whispers she'd been hearing from the old vehicle suddenly made perfect sense. The ambulance hadn't been trying to tell her about its mechanical needs. It was trying to tell her about Eleanor Whitfield. The young mechanic turned off her headlamp and gathered her tools, but her mind remained illuminated by the extraordinary discovery. Tomorrow, she would begin the most important restoration of her life. Not just bringing an old ambulance back to mechanical life, but bringing the story of a true American hero back to the light where it belonged. Outside, the rain was beginning to ease, and the first stars were appearing through breaks in the clouds. Maya looked once more at the ambulance, its familiar silhouette now charged with new meaning, and whispered, "I hear you now, Eleanor. I hear you, and I'm going to make sure the world hears you too." If you enjoyed this epic story of courage, discovery, and the power of hidden heroes, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true story adaptations that will inspire and amaze you. Turn on the bell icon to never miss our latest stories of extraordinary people who changed the world through ordinary acts of heroism.
Maya Chen barely slept that night. She lay in her small apartment above her grandmother's garage, staring at the ceiling while images of Eleanor Whitfield's photographs played through her mind like scenes from an old film reel. The young woman's face haunted her, so similar to Maya's own age, yet carrying the weight of experiences that seemed impossible for someone so young to have endured. Every time Maya closed her eyes, she saw those intelligent, dark eyes staring back at her across a century of silence, as if Eleanor herself was pleading for her story to finally be told. By dawn, Maya had made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't simply restore the ambulance and pretend she'd never found the hidden compartment. But as the first pale light of morning filtered through her bedroom window, Maya began to realize just how complicated her discovery was going to make her life. She arrived at Henderson's Classic Restorations before anyone else, as had become her habit over the past few months. The barn felt different now, charged with a sense of purpose that went far beyond mechanical restoration. Maya went straight to the ambulance, running her hands along its weathered fenders with new reverence. This wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a monument to courage, a testament to sacrifice, and possibly the key to rewriting a piece of forgotten history. Frank Henderson arrived an hour later, carrying his usual gas station coffee and wearing the expression of a man who'd been in the restoration business long enough to recognize trouble when he saw it. Maya was sitting on an overturned crate beside the ambulance, Eleanor's satchel open on her lap, documents spread carefully on a clean shop towel beside her. "Maya, what the hell are you doing?" Frank's voice carried the particular tone of a boss who'd walked into something he didn't want to deal with before his second cup of coffee. Maya looked up at him, her eyes bright with excitement and determination. "Frank, you need to see this. You need to see what I found." Maya showed Frank the hidden compartment and Eleanor's documents. His irritation melted into amazement. "Jesus Christ, Maya, do you have any idea what you've stumbled into here? This isn't just a restoration project anymore. This is historical evidence. This is the kind of thing that belongs in the Smithsonian, not in some backwater restoration shop in Nebraska." Maya had been expecting this reaction, but hearing Frank voice her own fears made them feel more real, more immediate. "But Frank, we can't just hand this over to some museum bureaucracy. Eleanor Whitfield trusted this ambulance to tell her story eventually. She hid these documents for a reason, and she chose to donate the vehicle to us for restoration. There has to be a reason for that." Frank rubbed his temples, a gesture Maya recognized as his standard response to complicated situations. "Maya, I run a business here. I restore cars for collectors and enthusiasts who pay good money for quality work. I don't run a historical research institute, and I sure as hell don't have the resources or expertise to authenticate century-old documents or verify military records." The conversation continued for most of the morning, with Frank raising practical concerns while Maya pushed back with passionate arguments about their responsibility to Eleanor's legacy. Other mechanics arrived and began their own projects, casting curious glances at the intense discussion taking place in Frank's corner office. Maya could see them whispering among themselves, and she knew that word of her discovery would spread through the tight-knit vintage vehicle community within hours. The first real obstacle came that afternoon in the form of a phone call. Frank had reluctantly agreed to let Maya continue her research, but he'd insisted on contacting the estate attorney who'd handled Eleanor Whitfield's donation to get more information about the legal implications of Maya's discovery. The conversation hadn't gone well. "The attorney wants the documents back," Frank announced grimly after hanging up the phone. "Says they should have been included in the estate inventory, and the family has a right to review anything found in the vehicle before it's released to the public." Maya felt her heart sink. She'd spent hours that morning carefully photographing each document, but she knew that losing access to the originals would severely hamper her ability to verify Eleanor's story. More importantly, she was terrified that Eleanor's family might choose to suppress the story entirely, robbing the world of an extraordinary tale of heroism and sacrifice. "What family?" Maya asked. "I thought Eleanor Whitfield died without any direct descendants." Frank consulted his notes. Apparently, she had a great-nephew who inherited most of the estate, a guy named Richard Whitfield, lives in Boston. He's already on his way out here to examine what you found. The news hit Maya like a punch to the stomach. In less than 24 hours, her discovery had attracted the attention of lawyers and family members who might have very different ideas about what should happen to Eleanor's story. Maya had grown up hearing her grandfather's tales about how bureaucracy and family politics could bury important stories, and she was determined to not let that happen to Eleanor. That evening, Maya made a decision that would have lasting consequences. Instead of going home, she stayed late at the shop, using the document scanner that Frank kept for insurance purposes to create high-resolution digital copies of everything in Eleanor's satchel. She told herself she was just being cautious, creating backups in case something happened to the originals. But deep down, she knew she was preparing for a fight. The scanning process took hours. And with each document that passed through the machine, Maya's understanding of Eleanor's story deepened and became more complex. There were maps marking safe houses and supply caches, correspondence with resistance fighters whose code names read like characters from a spy novel, and technical diagrams that showed modifications not just to the ambulance, but to other vehicles in Eleanor's unit. One letter, dated just days before the armistice, painted a particularly vivid picture of the dangers Eleanor had faced. Written to her brother Thomas, it described a harrowing escape from German forces after a rescue mission had gone wrong. Eleanor's words were matter-of-fact, almost casual in their description of events that could have easily resulted in her death or capture as a spy. "We had to abandon the primary route when Heinrich's contacts reported increased patrols near the river crossing," Eleanor had written. "The detour added 12 hours to our journey, and we were carrying wounded who couldn't afford the delay. Margaret made the difficult decision to split the convoy. She took the most critical cases via the coastal route, while I continued with the prisoners we'd extracted from the camp. By the time we reached the rendezvous point, German advance units were less than a mile behind us. If not for the local resistance fighters who created a diversion, I don't believe any of us would have made it across the lines." Maya found herself holding her breath as she read Eleanor's account, imagining the young woman barely older than herself making life-and-death decisions while enemy soldiers closed in around her. The casual tone of the letter made Eleanor's courage even more remarkable. She wrote about extraordinary heroism as if it were just another day at the office. But it was another document that truly shook Maya to her core. Hidden near the bottom of the satchel was a folded piece of paper that looked different from the others, older, more fragile, written in a different hand. As Maya carefully unfolded it, she realized she was looking at a letter addressed to Eleanor, dated December 1918, just weeks after the war had ended. The letter was from a man named Captain James Morrison, and as Maya read it, she began to understand the personal cost of Eleanor's heroism. Morrison wrote about the prisoners Eleanor had rescued during Operation Nightingale, providing names and details that weren't included in the official commendation. But more than that, he wrote about Eleanor herself, about the toll the war had taken on her, about the nightmares she couldn't shake, and about her decision to return to America and never speak of her wartime service. "You saved 237 souls during your time with us, but I fear the cost to your own soul may have been too high. I understand your decision to leave this all behind, to build a new life far from the memories that haunt you. But I want you to know that every man, woman, and child you brought back from behind enemy lines will carry your courage in their hearts forever, even if they never know your name." The letter went on to describe Eleanor's struggle with what Morrison called the invisible wounds of war, what Maya realized would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Eleanor had been a hero, but she'd also been a young woman traumatized by experiences that would have broken many people twice her age. Maya set the letter aside carefully, her hands shaking slightly. She was beginning to understand why Eleanor had hidden her story, why she'd spent the rest of her life in quiet anonymity rather than claiming the recognition she deserved. The war hadn't just made Eleanor a hero, it had also wounded her in ways that never fully healed. The sound of footsteps outside the barn interrupted Maya's thoughts. She quickly gathered the documents and returned them to their satchel, her heart racing. Through the window, she could see headlights approaching the shop. It was nearly midnight. Who would be visiting Henderson's Classic Restorations at this hour? Maya quickly shut down the scanner and turned off most of the lights, leaving only a single work lamp illuminated. She moved quietly to the window and peered out, trying to identify the approaching vehicle. It was a rental car, something generic and forgettable, and as it pulled into the parking area, Maya could see that it contained a single occupant. The driver sat in the car for several minutes after parking, and Maya got the distinct impression that he was studying the building, looking for signs of activity. Finally, the car door opened and a man in his 50s emerged. He was well-dressed in the kind of expensive casual clothing that suggested money and education,
and he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way. Maya knew instinctively that this had to be Richard Whitfield, Eleanor's great-nephew. He was a day early, and his late-night arrival suggested a level of urgency that made Maya deeply uncomfortable. She watched as he walked around the building, testing doors and peering through windows, clearly looking for a way in. Maya faced a moment of decision that would define everything that followed. She could reveal herself, let Richard Whitfield know she was there, and try to have a civilized conversation about Eleanor's legacy. Or she could remain hidden, gather more information about his intentions, and protect Eleanor's documents until she better understood what kind of man had inherited the right to control her great-aunt's story. The decision was made for her when Richard Whitfield produced a set of keys from his pocket and approached the main entrance to the barn. Maya realized with a sick feeling that the estate attorney must have provided him with access keys, giving him the legal right to examine the ambulance and anything found inside it. Maya quickly gathered Eleanor's satchel and moved deeper into the shadows of the barn, positioning herself behind a partially restored 1940 Ford pickup where she could observe without being seen. Her heart pounded as she heard the main door open and saw the beam of a powerful flashlight sweep across the workshop floor. Richard Whitfield moved through the barn with purpose, heading directly for the ambulance, as if he knew exactly what he was looking for. He spent several minutes examining the vehicle's exterior before moving to the driver's seat and beginning what appeared to be a systematic search of the interior. Maya watched in growing alarm as he discovered the hidden compartment she'd found the day before. But the compartment was empty now, and Maya could hear Richard Whitfield's frustrated cursing as he realized that whatever had been hidden there was already gone. He spent another 20 minutes searching the rest of the vehicle before expanding his search to the surrounding work area, looking for any sign of documents or artifacts that might have been removed. Maya remained frozen in her hiding spot, clutching Eleanor's satchel and trying to control her breathing. She was beginning to realize that Richard Whitfield's interest in his great-aunt's legacy might not be as benevolent as she'd hoped. The fact that he'd arrived in the middle of the night and immediately gone searching for hidden compartments suggested a level of prior knowledge that was troubling. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Richard Whitfield gave up his search and left the barn, locking the door behind him. Maya remained hidden until she heard his car start and drive away, then waited another hour to make sure he wasn't coming back before emerging from her hiding spot. As Maya finally made her way home in the early hours of the morning, she realized that her discovery had thrust her into a situation far more complex and potentially dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Eleanor Whitfield's story wasn't just a forgotten piece of history. It was a secret that someone was very interested in keeping buried. The next morning brought new challenges and revelations that would test Maya's resolve in ways she'd never anticipated. Frank arrived at the shop to find Maya already there, working on the ambulance's engine with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The conversation that followed would force Maya to confront some uncomfortable truths about the responsibilities that came with her extraordinary discovery. "Frank, we need to talk," Frank said, his tone more serious than she'd ever heard it. "I got 3 more phone calls yesterday afternoon after you left. The first was from a military historian at the University of Nebraska who somehow heard about your discovery and wants to examine the documents. The second was from a reporter at the World Herald who's already working on a story about the secret WWI ambulance found in Nebraska. And the third?" Frank paused, looking genuinely worried. "The third was from someone claiming to represent the Department of Defense, asking questions about classified materials that might have been found in a donated military vehicle." Maya felt the world shift beneath her feet. In less than 48 hours, her private discovery had become a public sensation, attracting attention from academics, journalists, and potentially government officials. The weight of responsibility she'd felt since finding Eleanor's documents suddenly became crushing. "Frank, I don't know how word got out so fast," Maya said, though she suspected that one of the other mechanics had overheard their conversation and spread the news through the restoration community's extensive gossip network. "It doesn't matter how it happened," Frank replied grimly. "What matters is that we're about to be descended upon by people with agendas we don't understand and resources we can't match. Maya, I like you and I respect your passion for this project, but I'm not going to let my business get caught in the middle of some historical controversy or government investigation." The ultimatum was delivered with the kind of finality that Maya recognized from her grandfather's generation, men who'd learned to make hard decisions and stick with them. Frank was giving her a choice: abandon her investigation into Eleanor's story or find somewhere else to pursue it. Maya spent the rest of that morning in a state of emotional turmoil, torn between her growing obsession with Eleanor's story and her loyalty to Frank, who'd given her opportunities that most 19-year-olds could only dream of. She knew that walking away from Henderson's classic restorations would mean giving up not just a job she loved, but also access to the tools, equipment, and expertise she needed to properly restore Eleanor's ambulance. But as she stood beside the old vehicle, running her hands along its weathered surfaces, Maya realized that some discoveries were too important to abandon, regardless of the personal cost. Eleanor Whitfield had risked everything to save the lives of strangers in a foreign war. The least Maya could do was risk her comfortable life to ensure that Eleanor's courage was finally recognized and honored. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Maya would find a way to continue her investigation, even if it meant striking out on her own. Eleanor's story wasn't just a forgotten piece of history. It was a secret that someone was very interested in keeping buried.
Maya's phone buzzed at 6:30 in the morning, jolting her awake from another restless night. The caller ID showed an unknown number with a Washington, D.C. area code, and Maya's stomach clenched as she remembered Frank's mention of someone from the Department of Defense. She let it go to voicemail, but 3 more calls followed in rapid succession, each from a different number, each leaving increasingly urgent messages requesting her immediate cooperation in what was described as a matter of national security. By the time Maya arrived at Henderson's classic restorations, a small crowd had gathered in the parking lot. She recognized Jim Patterson from the World Herald, his photographer already snapping pictures of the barn's exterior. There was also a woman in a navy blue suit who was clearly a government of some kind, flanked by 2 men who managed to look both anonymous and threatening at the same time. And standing slightly apart from the others, watching Maya's arrival with calculating eyes, was Richard Whitfield. Frank met her at her car before she could even turn off the engine. His face was grim, and Maya could see the stress of the morning's events written in every line around his eyes. "Maya, this has gotten completely out of hand. These people have been here since 7 o'clock, demanding access to the ambulance and asking questions about you specifically." "What kind of questions?" Maya asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Questions about your background, your qualifications, your family history. Questions about whether you might have had prior knowledge of what was hidden in that ambulance. Maya, they're treating this like some kind of espionage case." Maya felt a chill run down her spine. Espionage? "Frank, I restored a car and found some old documents. What could possibly be classified about letters from 1918? Frank's expression suggested he'd been wondering the same thing. "I don't know, but that woman from D.C. has been throwing around words like compartmentalized intelligence and operational security breaches. She says some of the information you found could compromise ongoing national security interests if it became public." The absurdity of it would have been laughable if not for the very serious-looking federal agents waiting to question her. Maya tried to process how Eleanor Whitfield's century-old heroism could possibly threaten modern national security, but before she could form a coherent theory, the woman in the navy blue suit was approaching with her government entourage in tow. "Miss Chen, I'm Special Agent Sarah Martinez with the Defense Intelligence Agency. We need to discuss your recent discovery and the potential security implications of any documents you may have found." Maya had been dreading this moment since Frank first mentioned the government's interest, but she'd also been preparing for it. "Agent Martinez, I'm happy to cooperate, but I think there may be some misunderstanding.
The documents I found are personal letters and photographs from World War I. They're historically significant, but I can't imagine how they could pose any security threat." Agent Martinez smiled, but it was the kind of smile that suggested she knew things Maya didn't. "Miss Chen, intelligence operations don't have expiration dates. The networks, methods, and relationships described in those documents may still be relevant to current operations. We need to examine everything you found and determine what can safely be released to the public." "And what about the parts you determine can't be safely released?" Maya asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "Those would remain classified indefinitely, for the protection of ongoing operations and the individuals involved." Maya felt her heart sink. They were going to bury Eleanor's story under a blanket of national security classifications, ensuring that her heroism remained hidden for another century. The injustice of it made Maya's hands shake with suppressed anger. Eleanor had risked everything to save lives, and now her own government was going to silence her memory to protect bureaucratic interests. "I'd like to see a warrant," Maya said quietly. The request clearly surprised Agent Martinez, who probably expected a 19-year-old mechanic to be intimidated into immediate compliance. "Miss Chen, we're asking for your voluntary cooperation in a matter of national security. I hope that won't be necessary." "But if I don't cooperate voluntarily, you'll get one anyway?" "If necessary, yes." Maya glanced at Frank, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the entire situation. She could see Richard Whitfield edging closer to their conversation, clearly trying to overhear what was being said. The reporter was maintaining a respectful distance, but had positioned himself where he could observe everything that happened. "I need some time to think about this, and I'd like to consult with an attorney before I make any decisions about turning over historical documents." Agent Martinez's expression hardened slightly. "Miss Chen, this isn't a negotiation. These documents contain information that could compromise national security. We're not asking for your permission to examine them. We're informing you that we will be examining them, either with your cooperation or without it."
The threat was clear, but Maya had spent enough time with her grandfather to understand how government bureaucracy worked. They needed to follow proper procedures, which meant she had at least a little time to figure out her next move. "Then I guess you'll need to follow proper procedures," she said, with more confidence than she felt. Maya felt her world tilt as she processed this information. Her grandfather had never mentioned anything about her grandfather's military service beyond basic details, and she certainly had never suggested that Eleanor's story might involve classified operations. "Colonel Hayes," Agent Martinez said carefully, "are you suggesting that Ms. Chen has some kind of official standing in this matter?" "I'm suggesting that you're about to make a very serious mistake," Hayes replied. "Eleanor Whitfield's story intersects with operations that are still classified not because they threaten current national security, but because they involve intelligence methods that were so far ahead of their time that their publication could reveal capabilities we still use today." The revelation hit Maya like a physical blow. Eleanor hadn't just been a courageous ambulance driver. She'd been involved in intelligence operations that were apparently still relevant over a century later. Colonel Hayes continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to briefing high-ranking officials. "Operation Nightingale wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a sophisticated intelligence operation that established communication networks and safe houses that remained active throughout the war and beyond. Some of those networks evolved into the infrastructure that became the foundation for modern CIA operations in Europe." Maya's grandmother moved to her side, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "Maya finds these documents because Eleanor wants the story told. Eleanor waits 100 years for the right person to find her truth. You think that Eleanor gives an ambulance to the place where Maya works. Eleanor chooses Maya because Maya has the heart to understand what the story means." The suggestion that Eleanor had somehow orchestrated her own discovery was almost too fantastic to believe.
but Maya remembered her growing sense that the ambulance had been trying to communicate with her. Could Eleanor's donation really have been targeted specifically at Maya? Mrs. Chen, Agent Martinez said, clearly struggling to maintain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond her initial parameters. With respect, we're dealing with classified material that requires proper handling through official channels. Maya's grandmother drew herself up to her full height, which wasn't much, but her presence suddenly seemed to fill the parking lot. Mrs. Chen, I came to America as a refugee from war. I know what happens when the government decides people's stories are too dangerous to tell. I know what happens when heroes die in silence because bureaucrats are afraid of the truth. The elderly woman's words carried a weight of personal experience that made everyone present fall silent. Maya realized that her grandmother's life story, like Eleanor's, probably contained chapters that had never been shared with younger generations. My husband, Lin Chen continued, serves in a unit that does things never talked about, never written in official records. He carries secrets until the day he dies. But Eleanor's secrets are different. Eleanor's secrets about courage, about saving lives, about a young woman who gives everything for strangers. These secrets are supposed to inspire, not hide. Colonel Hayes stepped forward again, and Maya got the impression that he and her grandmother had planned this intervention carefully. Agent Martinez, I have contacts at your agency who can verify what I'm about to tell you. Eleanor Whitfield's intelligence work was declassified by executive order in 1995, but the paperwork was never properly processed because no one realized the significance of her contributions. Legally, her story can be told without compromising any current operations. Maya felt a surge of hope, but Agent Martinez's expression suggested that the bureaucratic situation was more complicated than a simple oversight. Colonel Hayes, even if that's true, the decision about what information to release isn't mine to make. This would need to be reviewed by multiple agencies and cleared through proper channels. Which could take years, Maya said, understanding the game that was being played. Years during which Eleanor's story remains buried and her heroism continues to go unrecognized. That's the way the system works, Miss Chen. Security reviews take time. It was Richard Whitfield who inadvertently provided the next piece of the puzzle. He'd been listening to the conversation with growing agitation, and Maya could see that he was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the direction things were taking. This is ridiculous. Agent Martinez, surely there's a way to resolve this without dragging my family's private business through some extended government review. Perhaps we could reach an understanding that would allow certain sensitive materials to be handled discreetly, while permitting appropriate historical recognition of my great-aunt's service. The suggestion was reasonable on its surface, but something in Richard's tone made Maya suspicious. She was beginning to wonder if his real concern was less about protecting Eleanor's classified legacy and more about controlling how her story was told. Colonel Hayes seemed to have similar suspicions. Mr. Whitfield, I'm curious about your interest in controlling your great-aunt's narrative. According to the estate records, you inherited Eleanor's property, but she specifically designated this ambulance for restoration and historical preservation. Why are you suddenly concerned about limiting public access to her story?
Richard's smooth facade finally cracked entirely. Because there are aspects of my great-aunt's service that could be embarrassing to the family if they became public. Eleanor wasn't just involved in rescue operations, she was involved in activities that could be interpreted as unauthorized intelligence gathering, possibly even espionage. The admission hung in the air like a confession, and Maya suddenly understood what was really happening. Richard wasn't trying to protect national security or honor his great-aunt's memory. He was trying to prevent the revelation of activities that might complicate his own life or career. Mr. Whitfield, Colonel Hayes said quietly, are you suggesting that your great-aunt was engaged in treasonous activities? I'm suggesting that she exceeded her authority and engaged in operations that weren't sanctioned by her superiors, Richard replied defensively.
operations that could be misinterpreted if they became public knowledge. Maya felt her anger boiling over. Misinterpreted. Your great-aunt saved lives. She rescued prisoners who were going to be executed. How could that possibly be misinterpreted as anything other than heroic? Because she used methods and established contacts that weren't authorized by her commanding officers. Methods that could be construed as collaboration with enemy agents or unauthorized intelligence sharing. The accusation was so outrageous that for a moment, no one responded. Then Colonel Hayes stepped forward with an expression that made Maya glad she wasn't on the receiving end of his attention. "Mr. Whitfield," Hayes said in a voice that could have frozen steel, "I've spent 40 years in military intelligence and I've seen the records of Operation Nightingale. Your great-aunt was operating under direct orders from the highest levels of Allied command. Her contacts were approved assets, her methods were sanctioned by people with clearances you couldn't imagine, and her results saved not just the lives of prisoners, but provided intelligence that shortened the war and saved thousands more Allied casualties." Maya watched Richard Whitfield's face cycle through several emotions as he realized that his attempt to discredit Eleanor had backfired spectacularly. But rather than backing down, he seemed to double down on his position. "Mr. Whitfield, with respect, you weren't there. You don't know what really happened or what compromises she might have made. All I'm asking is that we proceed carefully and make sure that any information released protects both national security and my family's reputation." Maya's grandmother made a sound of disgust that managed to convey decades of experience with selfish behavior. "Richard Whitfield, you shame ancestor who died for courage you never have. Eleanor saves lives while you worry about reputation." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of yet another vehicle, this one a van bearing the logo of a major television network. Maya's heart sank as she realized that her small-scale discovery was rapidly becoming a media circus that would make any kind of careful, thoughtful exploration of Eleanor's story nearly impossible. Jim Patterson from the World Herald approached Maya with the expression of a reporter who'd stumbled into a much bigger story than he'd expected. "Miss Chen, I've been doing some research on Eleanor Whitfield since yesterday, and I've discovered some interesting connections. Did you know that she was mentioned in several books about women's contributions to WW1 intelligence operations? And that there's a memorial to Operation Nightingale personnel at Arlington National Cemetery?" Maya's heart leapt. If Eleanor's contributions were already acknowledged in published histories and honored at Arlington, then the security concerns being raised by Agent Martinez and the reputation concerns voiced by Richard Whitfield were largely irrelevant. "What kind of memorial?" Colonel Hayes asked, and I could see that he was as interested in this information as I was. "A section of the Women's Memorial that specifically honors female intelligence operatives from both world wars," Patterson replied, consulting his notes. "Eleanor Whitfield is listed by name, along with about 30 other women who participated in classified operations. The memorial was dedicated in 2000 with full military honors." Agent Martinez looked genuinely surprised by this information, and Maya realized that the federal agent's knowledge of Eleanor's case was probably limited to whatever brief summary had been prepared for her by subordinates who hadn't done thorough research. "Mr. Patterson," Martinez said carefully, "are you certain about this memorial?" "Absolutely. I spoke with the memorial's curator this morning. She said Eleanor Whitfield's contributions were declassified and approved for public recognition during the Clinton administration's initiative to honor previously unrecognized female veterans." Maya felt a surge of vindication, but also a growing anger at the bureaucratic incompetence that had nearly resulted in Eleanor's story being buried again. If her contributions were already publicly recognized and honored at the nation's most prestigious military cemetery, then there was no legitimate security reason to prevent her complete story from being told.
Richard Whitfield, however, seemed determined to find other obstacles. Even if the security issues have been resolved, there are still family privacy concerns and questions about the proper handling of personal documents. Maya found these materials, but legally they're still part of my great-aunt's estate. Colonel Hayes turned to Richard with an expression that suggested his patience was wearing thin. Mr. Whitfield, your great-aunt specifically donated this vehicle for historical restoration and preservation. She clearly intended for its contents to be discovered and shared. You don't have the legal right to suppress historical documents that she intended to become public. That's a matter of interpretation, Richard replied. Eleanor never explicitly stated that she wanted her personal correspondence made public. Maya's grandmother stepped forward again, and Maya could see that she'd reached the end of her tolerance for Richard's objections. Eleanor leaves the ambulance with a hiding place because she wants the story told. She waits for the right person to find the truth. Maya finds the truth because Eleanor trusts Maya to tell the story a right way. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the barn. One of the federal agents who had been examining the ambulance came jogging over to Agent Martinez with an expression of excitement and concern. "Ma'am, you need to see what we found in the engine compartment. There's another hidden compartment, and it contains materials that weren't in the satchel Miss Chen discovered." Maya's heart stopped. Another compartment? She'd been over every inch of that ambulance multiple times. How could she have missed something? As the group moved toward the barn, Maya realized that her discovery of Eleanor's satchel had been just the beginning of a much larger revelation. The ambulance held more secrets than she'd imagined, and each new discovery was attracting more attention from people whose motives she was beginning to deeply distrust. The second compartment was concealed behind the ambulance's radiator, accessible only by removing several engine components. It was smaller than the first hiding place Maya had found, but what it contained made everyone present fall silent with amazement. Inside was a metal box containing what appeared to be photographs of military installations, detailed maps of German defensive positions, and documents written in code. Agent Martinez examined the materials with growing excitement. "This is definitely classified material, even by current standards. Miss Chen, this changes everything. These documents contain intelligence information that could still be sensitive." Maya looked at the materials over Agent Martinez's shoulder and felt her understanding of Eleanor's story shift once again. These weren't personal letters or unit photographs. They were the working documents of a sophisticated intelligence operation with codes, contact information, and strategic assessments that demonstrated a level of planning and execution that was extraordinary for its time. Colonel Hayes examined one of the coded documents with obvious expertise. "Agent Martinez, this is a frequency schedule for radio communications between resistance cells and Allied intelligence. If I'm reading this correctly, Eleanor wasn't just rescuing prisoners, she was coordinating intelligence networks across occupied France." Maya felt the pieces of Eleanor's story clicking into place with frightening clarity. The young woman in the photographs hadn't just been a courageous ambulance driver who'd gone beyond her duty to save lives. She'd been a central figure in one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations of World War I, coordinating resources and communications across enemy territory while maintaining her cover as a medical volunteer. But Maya also realized that this new discovery was going to complicate everything. The materials in the second compartment were clearly more sensitive than Eleanor's personal letters, and their existence would give Agent Martinez and the other federal officials much stronger grounds for classifying the entire discovery. As if reading her thoughts, Agent Martinez turned to Maya with an expression of professional regret. "Miss Chen, I'm sorry, but this discovery changes our assessment of the security implications. We're going to need to take custody of all materials found in this vehicle pending a complete security review." Maya felt her world crashing down around her. After everything she'd learned about Eleanor's courage and sacrifice, after all the obstacles she'd overcome to bring Eleanor's story to light, the bureaucratic machinery was going to grind it all into classified silence. But Maya's grandmother stepped forward one more time, and when she spoke, her voice carried an authority that made everyone present pay attention.
Agent Martinez, before you take Eleanor's story away from the world, you need to understand something important. Eleanor Whitfield is not just a hero of American history. She is a hero of my family's history, too. Maya stared at her grandmother in shock. "Nai, what do you mean?" Lin Chan looked at her granddaughter with eyes that held decades of carefully guarded secrets. "Maya, Eleanor Whitfield saves the life of the man who becomes my father. Without Eleanor, my family dies in France in 1918. Without Eleanor, I never born, your mother never born, you never find her story."
The revelation hit Maya like a physical blow. Her own existence was connected to Eleanor's heroism through threads of history that stretched back over a century. Eleanor hadn't just been trying to communicate with Maya through the ambulance. Maya had been specifically chosen to find Eleanor's story because of a debt that spanned generations. Agent Martinez and the other officials looked stunned by this revelation, but Colonel Hayes was nodding as if pieces of a puzzle were falling into place for him too. "Mrs. Chen," Hayes said gently, "what was your father's name?" "Jean-Luc Moreau," Lin replied. "He is a French resistance fighter who helps Eleanor coordinate networks in occupied territory. Eleanor saves him from the German execution squad 2 days before the armistice. He is my father, Maya's great-grandfather." Maya felt her knees go weak as she processed the implications of her grandmother's revelation. Eleanor's story wasn't just historically important, it was personally, intimately connected to Maya's own family history. The ambulance hadn't been randomly donated to Henderson's Classic Restorations. Eleanor had somehow arranged for it to be restored by the great-great-granddaughter of a man whose life she'd saved. But even as Maya marveled at the extraordinary connections that had brought Eleanor's story to light, she realized that the battle to tell that story was far from over. The forces arrayed against her were powerful, well-funded, and determined to maintain their control over information that they considered too sensitive for public consumption. Maya looked around at the assembled group, federal agents, family members, reporters, and military officials, and realized that Eleanor's legacy had become a battleground where competing interests would fight for control of her memory. But Maya also knew that she held advantages that her opponents didn't fully understand. She had Eleanor's complete trust, her grandmother's family connection, and Colonel Hayes's military expertise. Most importantly, she had something that none of the bureaucrats and officials could claim. She truly understood what Eleanor's story meant, not just as a historical curiosity or a security concern, but as a testament to the extraordinary courage that ordinary people could summon when faced with impossible choices. The battle for Eleanor Whitfield's legacy was about to enter its most crucial phase, and Maya Chen was prepared to risk everything to ensure that the truth would finally be told. The silence that followed Lin Chen's revelation stretched across the parking lot like the moment before lightning strikes. Maya felt her understanding of everything, her family history, her connection to Eleanor, even her own identity, reshaping itself around this extraordinary truth. Eleanor Whitfield hadn't just been a hero to faceless strangers. She had been the guardian angel who ensured Maya's very existence. Colonel Hayes was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades piecing together the hidden stories of war. "Mrs. Chen, Jean-Luc Moreau was more than just a resistance fighter. According to the classified files I've reviewed, he was one of the primary coordinators for the Underground Railroad that moved Allied prisoners and downed airmen out of occupied territory. If Eleanor saved his life, she preserved one of the most important intelligence assets the Allies had in France." Maya's grandmother nodded slowly, her eyes distant with memory. "My father never talks much about war, but before he dies, he tells me about American Angel who appears in night like ghost, who saves him when German soldiers come to village where he hides. He says she drives ambulance that moves like shadow through enemy lines, and she speaks French like native, but fights like warrior. He says she saves not just his life, but lives of dozens of people he helps escape to freedom." Agent Martinez looked genuinely shaken by these revelations. Maya could see her trying to reconcile the classified documents in her hands with the personal testimony that was rewriting her understanding of Eleanor's importance to American intelligence operations. Mrs. Chen, if what you're saying is true, then Eleanor Whitfield's contributions may be even more significant than we initially realized. They are, came a new voice from the edge of the crowd. Everyone turned to see an elderly man approaching, walking with the aid of a cane, but moving with unmistakable purpose. He was perhaps 80 years old, impeccably dressed despite his age, and carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Colonel Hayes straightened slightly, and Maya caught the subtle signs of recognition and respect in his posture. "General Morrison," Hayes said formally, "I wasn't expecting to see you here, sir." Maya's heart stopped as she processed the name. Morrison. Captain James Morrison, who had written the letter to Eleanor about the invisible wounds of war. But that would make this man the great-nephew of Captain James Morrison. The elderly man confirmed, as if reading Maya's thoughts. "I'm David Morrison, and I've been waiting 70 years to meet the family of Jean-Luc Moreau." The coincidences were becoming almost too extraordinary to believe, but as Maya looked around at the assembled group, she began to understand that these weren't coincidences at all. Someone had orchestrated this convergence, bringing together all the threads of Eleanor's story at precisely the right moment.
General Morrison approached Lin Chen with obvious emotion. "Mrs. Chen, your father saved my great-uncle's life on 3 separate occasions during the war." Jim Morrison spoke of Jean-Luc as the finest soldier he ever served with, and he spent the rest of his life trying to track down the families of the people who had made his survival possible. Maya felt tears forming in her eyes as she watched her grandmother and the general recognize each other as inheritors of a shared legacy. The personal connections that were emerging weren't just historical curiosities, they were the foundation of lifelong bonds forged in the crucible of war. "General Morrison," Agent Martinez said carefully, "I'm not sure I understand your role in this situation." The general smiled, and Maya saw in his expression the same intelligent calculation she'd noticed in Eleanor's photographs. "Agent Martinez, I represent a group of individuals who have been working for several decades to ensure that the complete story of Operation Nightingale is finally told. We've been waiting for the right moment and the right person to bring Eleanor's legacy into the light." Maya felt her world shift again as she realized the implications of the general's words. "You've been waiting for me?" "We've been waiting for someone with the skills to restore Eleanor's ambulance and the passion to understand what her story really means," Morrison confirmed. "Someone with a personal connection strong enough to withstand the pressures that we knew would arise when the truth began to emerge." Richard Whitfield stepped forward with obvious agitation. "General Morrison, with respect, this is still a family matter. My great-aunt's estate and legacy are my responsibility to manage." Morrison turned to Richard with an expression that made Maya glad she wasn't on the receiving end of his attention. "Mr. Whitfield, your great-aunt specifically requested that her story be withheld until it could be told by someone who would understand its full significance. She spent 60 years waiting for that person to appear." "That's impossible," Richard protested. "Eleanor died in 1995. She couldn't have known about Maya or arranged for any of this." General Morrison reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope that had been carefully preserved but was clearly old. "Eleanor Whitfield wrote this letter in 1994, 1 year before her death. It's addressed to the person who will find my story and contains specific instructions about how her legacy should be handled." Maya accepted the envelope with trembling hands. Her name was written on the front in Eleanor's familiar handwriting, though the letter had obviously been written decades before Maya's birth. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Eleanor's careful script. "To the person who will find my story," Maya read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. If you are reading this, then the ambulance has chosen you as surely as I chose the ambulance all those years ago in France. You have found my documents not by accident, but because you possess the courage and understanding necessary to ensure that the truth is finally told." Maya paused, her voice breaking with emotion as she continued reading. "I have carried the weight of secrecy for 76 years, not because I was ashamed of what we did, but because the world was not ready to understand the sacrifices that ordinary people made in extraordinary times. But you are ready. You have been chosen because you have the strength to bear witness to courage, the wisdom to honor sacrifice, and the determination to ensure that heroism is not forgotten." The letter continued with specific instructions about how Eleanor wanted her story to be shared, not through official channels or academic institutions, but through the passionate advocacy of someone who understood that history belongs to the people who lived it, not to the bureaucrats who control it. "I have one final request," Maya read, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "Find the families of those we saved. Tell them that their loved ones' sacrifices were not in vain. Tell them that courage echoes across generations and that the bonds forged in wartime transcend death itself. And tell them that an old woman who never had children of her own lived to see her legacy carried forward by the great-great-granddaughter of a man whose life she was honored to save." The final words of the letter left everyone present in stunned silence. Eleanor somehow knew not just that Maya would find her story, but that Maya was connected to her wartime service through family ties that spanned nearly a century. Agent Martinez was the first to speak, her voice filled with obvious awe. How could she have known? How could Eleanor Whitfield have predicted any of this? General Morrison smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had waited decades to reveal a carefully guarded secret. Because Eleanor spent 40 years after the war tracking down the families of everyone she saved during Operation Nightingale. She maintained correspondence with survivors and their descendants across 3 generations, creating a network that allowed her to monitor their lives and ensure their stories would eventually be told. Maya felt the pieces of an enormous puzzle clicking into place. She knew about my family. She knew I was becoming a mechanic. She arranged for the ambulance to be donated to Henderson's specifically because she knew I worked there. And
She did more than that, Morrison confirmed. Eleanor established a foundation in 1985 that has been quietly supporting vintage vehicle restoration programs across the Midwest. Henderson's Classic Restorations received grants that allowed Frank to expand his business and hire additional mechanics, including you. Frank Henderson, who had been listening to these revelations with growing amazement, finally found his voice. The anonymous benefactor who helped us expand 3 years ago, that was Eleanor Whitfield? It was her foundation, operating through multiple intermediaries to ensure that their support couldn't be traced back to her, Morrison explained. Eleanor wanted to create the conditions necessary for her story to be discovered by the right person at the right time. Maya sat down heavily on a nearby crate, overwhelmed by the realization that her entire career path had been subtly influenced by a woman she'd never met, but who had been watching over her family for generations. The weight of responsibility that came with this knowledge was almost crushing. Colonel Hayes seemed to understand what Maya was feeling. "Miss Chen, I know this is a lot to process, but I want you to understand something important. Eleanor didn't manipulate your life or force you into this situation. She simply created opportunities. Every choice you made, to become a mechanic, to focus on restoration work, to pursue Eleanor's story despite the obstacles, those were your choices, made with the same courage and determination that Eleanor recognized in herself." Jim Patterson, the reporter who had been documenting everything with growing excitement, stepped forward with his notebook
filled with details that Maya knew would reshape how the public understood both World War I history and the power of individual heroism. Ms. Chen, this story goes far beyond anything I could have imagined when I first heard about your discovery. With your permission, I'd like to begin working on a comprehensive account that honors both Eleanor's legacy and your family's connection to her story. Maya looked around at the assembled group, federal agents, military officials, family members, and media representatives who all had different perspectives on how Eleanor's story should be told. But she also realized that Eleanor's letter had given her something that none of the others possessed: explicit authorization to make decisions about how the truth should be shared. I want Eleanor's complete story told, not just the parts that are convenient for bureaucrats or comfortable for family members, but the whole truth about what she did and what it cost her. Agent Martinez looked uncomfortable with Maya's declaration. Ms. Chen, there are still security considerations that need to be addressed. Some of the materials you found contain information that could compromise ongoing operations or reveal intelligence methods that are still in use. General Morrison stepped forward with an expression that suggested he'd been preparing for this moment for years. Agent Martinez, I have clearances that allow me to make determinations about the classification status of Operation Nightingale materials. As of this moment, I'm authorizing the declassification of all documents related to Eleanor Whitfield's service with the exception of specific technical details that remain operationally sensitive. Maya felt a surge of hope, but she also noticed that Agent Martinez didn't look convinced by the general's authority. Sir, with respect, declassification decisions need to go through proper channels. I can't simply release classified materials based on verbal authorization. Colonel Hayes reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder that he handed to Agent Martinez. Agent Martinez, these are the official declassification orders, signed by the appropriate authorities and processed through the proper channels. General Morrison has been working through the bureaucracy for 3 years to ensure that Eleanor's story could be told when the time was right. As Agent Martinez reviewed the documents, Maya realized that every aspect of this confrontation had been carefully planned and orchestrated by people who understood how government bureaucracy worked and had taken steps to eliminate the obstacles that would normally prevent Eleanor's story from being shared. But it was Richard Whitfield who provided the final surprise of the day. He'd been growing increasingly agitated as it became clear that his attempts to control Eleanor's legacy were failing, and Maya could see that he was preparing to make one last, desperate play. Even if the security issues are resolved, there are still questions about the authenticity of these materials. How do we know that these documents are genuine? How do we know that this entire story isn't some elaborate fabrication designed to create a sensational media narrative? The accusation was so outrageous that for a moment, everyone present was too stunned to respond. Then, General Morrison approached Richard with an expression that made Maya genuinely fear for the man's safety. Mr. Whitfield, are you suggesting that your great-aunt was a liar and a fraud? I'm suggesting that these documents could have been forged, that this entire story could have been fabricated by someone with an agenda. There's no independent verification of any of these claims. Maya felt her anger boiling over at the suggestion that Eleanor's heroism was somehow a fabrication. But before she could respond, her grandmother stepped forward with something Maya had never seen before: a small wooden box that had been carefully preserved for decades.
Richard Whitfield, Lin Chen said in a voice that carried absolute authority. You want proof that Eleanor Whitfield saved my father's life? You want proof that she is a hero worthy of honor? Maya's grandmother opened the box to reveal a medal that Maya recognized as the French Croix de Guerre, along with a photograph of a young man in military uniform standing beside the very ambulance that now sat in Henderson's restoration barn. This story is about to get even more incredible. If you're as captivated as we are by Maya's discovery, please hit that like button and share this with fellow history enthusiasts. Don't miss what happens next. This medal was given to my father by General Charles de Gaulle himself for his service with resistance. And this photograph was taken 3 days before Eleanor saved his life from a German execution squad. You see the ambulance in the picture? Same ambulance that sits there now. You see a man standing beside an ambulance? That my father, your great-aunt's partner in saving lives of people who would otherwise die in Nazi camps. The photograph was the final piece of evidence that silenced all doubt about Eleanor's story. Maya could see the ambulance in its wartime configuration, and standing beside it were two figures, Jean-Luc Moreau and Eleanor Whitfield, partners in one of the most extraordinary rescue operations in military history. Richard Whitfield examined the photograph with growing resignation, clearly recognizing that his attempts to discredit Eleanor's story had failed completely. I never knew about any of this. Eleanor never spoke about her war service. Because she carried invisible wounds that never healed, because the cost of her heroism was trauma that she spent the rest of her life trying to manage. Richard, your great-aunt was a hero, but she was also a human being who suffered for her courage. That's not something to be ashamed of, it's something to be honored. Maya watched Richard's expression change as he began to understand the true nature of Eleanor's legacy. She realized that his attempts to suppress Eleanor's story hadn't been motivated by shame about her heroism, but by ignorance about what that heroism had actually entailed. As the day wore on and the various officials completed their examinations and paperwork, Maya found herself standing alone beside Eleanor's ambulance, trying to process everything that had been revealed. The vehicle looked the same as it had that morning, but Maya's understanding of what it represented had been completely transformed. Eleanor Whitfield had been more than just a courageous ambulance driver. She had been a central figure in one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations of World War I, coordinating networks that saved hundreds of lives while simultaneously gathering information that helped bring the war to an earlier conclusion. She had formed partnerships with resistance fighters like Jean-Luc Moreau that transcended national boundaries and created bonds of trust that lasted for generations. But most importantly, Eleanor had recognized that her story belonged not to government bureaucrats or family members who wanted to control her legacy, but to future generations who could learn from her example of courage and sacrifice. She had spent decades ensuring that her story would eventually be told by someone who understood its true significance, someone whose own existence had been made possible by Eleanor's heroism. As Maya ran her hands along the ambulance's weathered fenders, she realized that her role as Eleanor's chosen storyteller was just beginning. The restoration of the vehicle would continue, but it would now be accompanied by a much larger project, ensuring that Eleanor Whitfield's extraordinary courage was finally recognized and honored by a world that had forgotten too many heroes. General Morrison approached Maya as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the restoration barn. Ms. Chen, I know this has been an overwhelming day, but I want you to know that you have support from people who understand what Eleanor's legacy means. We've been waiting 70 years to see her story told properly. Maya looked at the elderly general, understanding that he represented not just his own family's connection to Eleanor, but a network of descendants and survivors who had been carrying pieces of Eleanor's story for decades. General Morrison, what happens now? Now you restore the ambulance, and we help you tell Eleanor's story the way she wanted it to be told, not through official channels or academic institutions, but through the passionate advocacy of someone who understands that heroism belongs to the people, not to the bureaucrats who try to control it. As the various officials and family members prepared to leave, Maya realized that her discovery had accomplished something that Eleanor herself might never have imagined. It had brought together the scattered threads of a story that spanned generations and continents, creating connections between families who had been separated by time and circumstance, but united by shared experiences of courage and sacrifice. The battle for Eleanor Whitfield's legacy was far from over, but Maya now understood that she wasn't fighting it alone. She had allies who had been waiting decades for this moment, resources that had been carefully preserved and protected, and most importantly, the explicit authorization of Eleanor herself to ensure that the truth was finally told.
As Maya locked up the restoration barn that evening,
She whispered a promise to the ambulance and the woman who had entrusted her with its secrets. "Eleanor, your story is going to be told. All of it. The courage, the sacrifice, the invisible wounds, and the love that made you risk everything for strangers. The world is going to know who you really were, and they're going to understand that heroes come in many forms, including young women who refuse to let other people's suffering go unanswered." The ambulance sat silently in the gathering darkness, but Maya could almost feel Eleanor's presence approving of the promise that had just been made. The restoration would continue, but now it carried the weight of history and the responsibility of ensuring that extraordinary courage was never again forgotten or ignored. Maya Chen stood in the restoration barn that had become hallowed ground, putting the finishing touches on Eleanor Whitfield's ambulance. The vehicle gleamed with a restoration that went far beyond mere mechanical perfection. Every bolt, every panel, every carefully preserved detail told the story of a woman whose courage had echoed across a century to find its voice in the hands of a young mechanic who understood what legacy truly meant. The barn itself had been transformed in the months since Eleanor's story had begun to emerge into the light. What had once been Frank Henderson's simple restoration shop had evolved into something between a museum and a shrine, with carefully displayed documents, photographs, and artifacts that painted a complete picture of Operation Nightingale and the extraordinary network of heroes who had made it possible. Maya ran her hand along the ambulance's fender, feeling the smooth paint that covered scars earned in the service of saving lives. Beneath her palm, she could sense the weight of history that the vehicle carried. Not just the mechanical history of gears and pistons and carefully crafted steel, but the human history of courage and sacrifice and determination that had transformed an ordinary Ford Model T into a monument to the extraordinary power of individual heroism. The restoration had taken on a significance that went far beyond anything Maya had ever imagined when she first heard the ambulance's whispers. Every component had been researched, documented, and restored not just to factory specifications, but to the exact configuration Eleanor had used during her wartime service. The hidden compartments had been preserved and made accessible, allowing visitors to understand how Eleanor had concealed documents and supplies during her dangerous missions behind enemy lines. But more importantly, the ambulance had become the centerpiece of a larger project that was reshaping how the world understood women's contributions to military intelligence operations. Eleanor's story had opened doors to dozens of other forgotten heroines, whose courage had been buried under decades of official secrecy and bureaucratic indifference. Frank Henderson approached Maya with an expression of pride mixed with amazement at how his small restoration shop had become the epicenter of a historical revelation. "Maya, I've got to admit, when you first started talking about that ambulance trying to communicate with you, I thought you were spending too much time alone with old cars. I never imagined that listening to what it had to say would lead to all this." Maya smiled as she looked around the barn, which was now filled with visitors, researchers, and journalists from around the world who had come to learn about Eleanor Whitfield and the network of heroes she had helped coordinate. "Frank, neither did I, but I think that's the point. Eleanor understood that heroism isn't about grand gestures or public recognition. It's about listening to what needs to be done and having the courage to do it, even when no one will ever know what you've sacrificed." The public response to Eleanor's story had been extraordinary. Jim Patterson's initial article in the World Herald had been picked up by national news organizations, leading to feature stories in major magazines, television documentaries, and academic conferences that were re-examining the role of intelligence operations in World War I. But Maya had been careful to ensure that the media attention served Eleanor's legacy rather than sensationalizing it. Working with General Morrison and Colonel Hayes, Maya had established the Eleanor Whitfield Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving the stories of unrecognized heroes and supporting educational programs that taught young people about the power of individual courage.
The Foundation's first major project had been the creation of a traveling exhibit that would take Eleanor's ambulance and her story to schools and communities across the country. Maya's grandmother had become an unexpected star of the Foundation's educational programs. Lin Chen's first-hand accounts of her father's wartime service, combined with her powerful personal testimony about the multi-generational impact of heroism, had made her one of the most sought-after speakers in the country. The Foundation had also accomplished something that Maya considered even more important than public recognition. It had reunited the scattered families of Operation Nightingale's participants. Using Eleanor's carefully preserved correspondence and General Morrison's military contacts, they had identified and contacted descendants of more than 200 people whose lives had been saved by Eleanor's network of heroes. The emotional power of these reunions had surprised everyone involved. Maya had watched elderly people break down in tears as they learned for the first time that their parents or grandparents had been rescued by a network of heroes who had risked everything to save strangers. She had seen grown men and women struggle to comprehend that their very existence had been made possible by the courage of people they had never heard of but who had loved them enough to die for them.
One of the most moving reunions had involved the Kowalski family from Chicago, whose grandfather had been among the prisoners rescued during Eleanor's final mission before the armistice. 3 generations of Kowalskis had traveled to Nebraska to see Eleanor's ambulance and learn about the woman who had made their family's existence possible. When Maya showed them the photograph of their grandfather standing with other rescued prisoners beside Eleanor's ambulance, there hadn't been a dry eye in the barn. But perhaps the most significant development had been the transformation of Richard Whitfield. Eleanor's great-nephew had returned to Nebraska several times over the months following his initial hostile visit, each time with a better understanding of his great-aunt's legacy and a growing commitment to ensuring that her story was told completely and honestly. Richard approached Maya as she completed her final inspection of the ambulance's engine compartment. His manner had evolved from the smooth manipulation she'd first encountered to something approaching genuine humility. "Maya, I owe you an apology that I should have given months ago. I was so focused on protecting what I thought was my family's reputation that I nearly succeeded in burying the most heroic story in our family's history." Maya looked at Richard with the understanding that had come from months of learning about the complex ways that trauma and heroism intersected in Eleanor's life. "Richard, you were protecting Eleanor the way you thought she needed to be protected. She spent 70 years hiding her story because she understood that the world wasn't ready to hear it. You were just continuing that protection." "But I was wrong," Richard insisted. "The world needed to hear Eleanor's story, especially now when people are so cynical about heroism and so quick to assume that everyone has selfish motives. Eleanor's story proves that there are people who will risk everything for strangers, not because they want recognition or reward, but because they can't stand to watch other people suffer." Richard's transformation had been one of the unexpected gifts of Eleanor's story. He had used his resources and connections to help the Foundation expand its reach, and he had become one of its most effective advocates in corporate and political circles. More importantly, he had begun to understand that Eleanor's legacy wasn't something to be managed or controlled, but something to be celebrated and shared. The official dedication ceremony for the Eleanor Whitfield Memorial was scheduled for the following week, timed to coincide with Veterans Day, and designed to honor not just Eleanor, but all the unrecognized heroes whose stories had been buried by time and bureaucracy. The ceremony would feature the first public display of Eleanor's fully restored ambulance, along with exhibits that told the complete story of Operation Nightingale and its lasting impact on military intelligence operations. Maya had been invited to speak at the dedication, and she had spent weeks preparing remarks that would do justice to Eleanor's memory while inspiring others to understand that heroism was not the exclusive domain of professional soldiers or public figures. She wanted people to understand that Eleanor's story was not just about one extraordinary woman, but about the extraordinary potential that existed within ordinary people when they chose to act with courage and compassion. As Maya worked on her speech, she had been struck by the realization that Eleanor's story was still unfolding. The ambulance's restoration had been completed, the documents had been preserved and shared, and the public recognition had been achieved. But Eleanor's real legacy was the network of relationships and commitments that had grown out of her story, the foundation that would continue her work, the families that had been reunited with their histories, and the young people who had been inspired to understand that they too had the power to change the world. Colonel Hayes had become a regular visitor to the barn, and Maya had come to understand that his interest in Eleanor's story went beyond professional curiosity. He had lost his own son in Iraq, and Eleanor's example of young people choosing to sacrifice for others had helped him process his grief while finding meaning in his loss. "Maya," Hayes said as he approached her workstation, "I've been thinking about what you said last week about Eleanor's story being a beginning rather than an ending. I think you're right. The restoration of this ambulance isn't the culmination of Eleanor's legacy, it's the foundation for everything that comes next." Maya nodded, understanding what Hayes meant. Eleanor spent her life ensuring that her story would eventually be told by someone who would understand its significance. But I think she also understood that the real power of her story would come from what other people chose to do after hearing it. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a group Maya had been expecting, a delegation of high school students from Eleanor's hometown in Vermont who had traveled to Nebraska to see the ambulance and learn about their community's forgotten hero. Maya had been working with their teacher to develop an educational program that would help young people understand how individual choices could have historical consequences. The students approached the ambulance with a mixture of reverence and curiosity that reminded Maya of her own first encounter with Eleanor's story. They listened with obvious fascination as Maya explained the vehicle's history and showed them the hidden compartments where Eleanor had concealed documents and supplies during her missions. But it was when Maya shared Eleanor's letter to the person who will find my story that the students truly understood the significance of what they were witnessing. Maya watched their faces as she read Eleanor's words about courage echoing across generations and the importance of ensuring that heroism was not forgotten.
"Miss Chen," one of the students asked, "do you think Eleanor knew that her story would inspire other people to be heroes too?" Maya considered the question carefully before responding. "I think Eleanor understood that heroism isn't something you're born with. It's something you choose. And I think she knew that when people hear stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, it helps them understand that they have the same potential for courage." The student nodded thoughtfully. "So by telling her story, you're not just honoring what she did, you're helping other people understand what they could do." "Exactly," Maya confirmed. "Eleanor's story isn't just history, it's an invitation to understand that you don't have to be special or famous or powerful to make a difference in the world. You just have to care enough about other people to act when action is needed." As the students continued their examination of the ambulance, Maya found herself reflecting on how much her own life had changed since that rainy afternoon when she'd first discovered Eleanor's hidden compartment. She had begun the project as a young mechanic with a talent for restoration and an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. She was ending it as something approaching a historian, an educator, and an advocate for the power of individual courage. But Maya also understood that her role as Eleanor's storyteller was evolving rather than ending. The foundation would continue to discover and share the stories of forgotten heroes. The ambulance would travel the country, carrying Eleanor's message to new communities and inspiring new generations of young people to understand their own potential for heroism. Most importantly, Maya had come to understand that Eleanor's story was part of a larger narrative about the ways that courage and compassion could transcend the boundaries of time, nationality, and individual mortality. Eleanor's decision to risk her life for strangers had created ripple effects that were still expanding nearly a century later. touching the lives of people who would never know her name, but whose existence had been made possible by her sacrifices. As the day wound down and the visitors departed, Maya found herself alone in the barn with Eleanor's ambulance, just as she had been on that transformative afternoon 6 months earlier. But everything had changed. The vehicle was now fully restored, its mechanical systems purring with the precision that had made it such an effective tool for saving lives during wartime. The hidden compartments were accessible, but empty, their secrets finally shared with the world. Maya climbed into the driver's seat, running her hands over the steering wheel that Eleanor had gripped during those desperate nighttime runs through enemy territory. She could almost feel the presence of the young woman who had sat in this same seat, making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for dozens of people. "Eleanor?" Maya said quietly, addressing the woman whose spirit seemed to inhabit every surface of the restored ambulance. "I think we did it. Your story is being told, your courage is being recognized, and your legacy is inspiring other people to understand what heroism really means. I hope that wherever you are, you know that you're not forgotten anymore." Maya sat in the silence of the barn, listening for the whispers that had first drawn her to Eleanor's story. But the ambulance was quiet now, its message finally delivered, and its purpose finally fulfilled. Eleanor Whitfield's century of silence was over, and her voice would now echo through the words and actions of everyone whose life had been touched by her extraordinary example. As Maya prepared to lock up the barn and head home, she realized that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to carry Eleanor's legacy forward. The traveling exhibit would soon begin its journey across the country. The foundation would continue to discover and share the stories of other forgotten heroes, and Maya herself would continue to grow into the role that Eleanor had chosen for her, not just as a restorer of old vehicles, but as a guardian of historical truth and a champion of the extraordinary courage that ordinary people could summon when faced with impossible choices. Eleanor Whitfield had waited nearly a century for her story to be told. Now, thanks to the persistence of a young mechanic who had learned to listen to the whispers of history, that story would live forever, not just in books and museums, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who understood that true heroism begins with a simple decision to care more about other people's lives than about your own safety. The ambulance sat silently in the gathering darkness, no longer a forgotten relic, but a monument to courage, a testament to sacrifice, and a reminder that the power to change the world lies not in grand gestures or public declarations, but in the quiet determination of individuals who refuse to let other people's suffering go unanswered. Maya's work was finished, but Eleanor's legacy was just beginning its next chapter. Maya Chen stood at the podium in the Great Hall of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, looking out at an audience that included historians, veterans, government officials, and dozens of families whose lives had been touched by Eleanor Whitfield's legacy. Behind her, Eleanor's restored ambulance occupied the place of honor in the museum's newest permanent exhibition, Unsung Heroes, The Hidden Stories of American Courage.
At 24, Maya had become one of the country's youngest museum curators. But more importantly, she had evolved into something Eleanor herself would have recognized, a guardian of stories that the world needed to hear. The young woman, who had once worried about oil stains on her work clothes, now wore a curator's professional attire with quiet confidence. But her hands still carried the calluses of someone who understood that history lived in the physical objects that people had touched, used, and treasured. 5 years ago, Maya began, her voice carrying easily through the hall's acoustics, I was a 19-year-old mechanic who thought she was simply restoring an old car. I had no idea that I was about to uncover one of the most extraordinary stories in American military history, or that this discovery would change not just my understanding of the past, but my vision of what courage looks like in the present. The audience listened with the kind of attention that Maya had learned to recognize in people who were hungry for authentic stories of heroism in a world that often seems short on genuine heroes. Over the past 5 years, Eleanor's story had reached millions of people through books, documentaries, educational programs, and museum exhibitions. But Maya had discovered that the most powerful impact came from intimate moments when individuals realized that they too possessed the capacity for extraordinary courage. Eleanor Whitfield was 22 years old when she volunteered to drive an ambulance in France during World War I. She was younger than some of the college students in this audience tonight. She had no military training, no intelligence background, and no reason to believe that she was capable of the kind of heroism that would eventually save hundreds of lives and help bring a devastating war to an earlier conclusion. Maya paused, letting her eyes scan the audience until she found the faces she was looking for. In the third row sat Lin Chen, now 83, but still sharp and vital, accompanied by her great-granddaughter who had recently turned 16. Nearby sat Richard Whitfield with his own teenage daughter, both of them wearing expressions of pride that would have amazed anyone who remembered Richard's initial hostility to Eleanor's story. In the front row, General David Morrison sat in his wheelchair, now nearing 90 but still attending every major event related to Eleanor's legacy. Beside him was Colonel Robert Hayes, retired but serving as the Foundation's military liaison, and Jim Patterson, whose initial newspaper article had grown into a Pulitzer Prize-winning book about the hidden roles of women in military intelligence operations. What made Eleanor extraordinary wasn't that she was born with special courage or unusual abilities. What made her extraordinary was her decision to act when action was needed, to care about strangers' suffering, and to persist in doing what was right even when the personal cost was overwhelming. The speech Maya was giving had been delivered in various forms hundreds of times over the past 5 years. She had spoken at high schools where teenagers learned that heroism wasn't limited to comic book characters and action movie stars. She had addressed military academies where future officers studied Eleanor's example of leadership under impossible circumstances. She had presented at academic conferences where historians debated the broader implications of Operation Nightingale for understanding intelligence operations and women's contributions to military success. But tonight's speech was special because it marked the culmination of a project that had consumed Maya's life for the past 5 years. The exhibition was designed to be permanent, ensuring that Eleanor's story would be preserved and shared for generations to come. More importantly, the exhibition had been designed as a template that could be replicated in museums across the country, spreading Eleanor's message about the power of individual courage to communities that might never have access to the traveling exhibit. The Eleanor Whitfield Foundation has now documented the stories of over 300 previously unrecognized heroes from conflicts spanning more than a century, Maya announced, and she could see the pride in the faces of the Foundation's board members who had worked tirelessly to expand their mission beyond Eleanor's individual story. We've learned that heroism takes many forms: combat medics who refused to leave wounded soldiers behind, civilian volunteers who risked their lives to help refugees, intelligence operatives who gathered information that saved countless lives, and resistance fighters who stood up to oppression even when survival seemed impossible. The Foundation's growth had been one of the most gratifying aspects of Maya's journey. What had begun as an effort to preserve Eleanor's legacy had evolved into a comprehensive program that identified, documented, and celebrated the stories of forgotten heroes from every American conflict. The Foundation operated research centers, funded academic scholarships, supported veteran services, and most importantly, created educational programs that helped young people understand that they too could make a difference in the world. Maya's role had evolved as well.
While she maintained her expertise in historical restoration, the foundation now operated the country's premier facility for preserving military vehicles and artifacts. Her primary focus had become education and advocacy. She traveled constantly, speaking at schools, museums, and community centers, sharing not just Eleanor's story, but the broader message that heroism was accessible to anyone who chose to act with courage and compassion. But tonight, Maya said, her voice taking on a more personal tone, I want to share something that goes beyond the historical significance of Eleanor's contributions or the educational impact of her legacy. I want to tell you about the letters. Over the past 5 years, Maya had received thousands of letters from people whose lives had been touched by Eleanor's story. Some came from descendants of Operation Nightingale participants who had finally learned the truth about their family histories. Others came from young people who had been inspired by Eleanor's example to pursue careers in public service, medicine, or military service.
Last month, Maya continued, I received a letter from a 16-year-old girl in Detroit who had heard Eleanor's story during a school presentation. She wrote to tell me that she had been planning to drop out of school because she felt like nothing she did mattered. But after learning about Eleanor, she realized that extraordinary contributions often begin with ordinary people who refuse to give up when things get difficult. She's now planning to study emergency medicine so she can save lives the way Eleanor did. Maya pulled out a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket. She ended her letter by saying, Ms. Chen, thank you for helping me understand that I don't have to be famous or powerful to make a difference. I just have to care enough about other people to act when action is needed. Those words could have been written by Eleanor herself. The audience responded with applause that was both appreciative and emotional. Maya had learned over the years that Eleanor's story resonated most powerfully when people understood that it wasn't just a historical curiosity, but a contemporary invitation to courage. Eleanor Whitfield spent 77 years of her life carrying the weight of her extraordinary service in silence, Maya said as the applause faded. She endured trauma, survivor's guilt, and the isolation that comes from carrying secrets too important to share. But she also spent those same 77 years ensuring that her story would eventually be told by someone who would understand its true significance. Maya's eyes found her grandmother in the audience, and she felt the familiar surge of gratitude for the woman who had provided the final piece of Eleanor's puzzle. Lin Chen's testimony about her father's connection to Eleanor had transformed Maya's discovery from an interesting historical footnote into a deeply personal mission that connected past and present in ways that still amazed everyone involved. Mrs. Lin Chen, Eleanor's partner Jean-Luc Moreau's daughter, is with us tonight, Maya announced, and the audience turned to acknowledge the elderly woman who had become one of the Foundation's most beloved speakers. Mrs. Chen often reminds us that heroes don't just save lives, they save futures. Every person Eleanor rescued went on to have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who exist today because a 22-year-old American woman decided that strangers' lives were worth risking her own. Lin Chen acknowledged the recognition with a small wave, her face showing the quiet pride of someone who had lived long enough to see her father's story properly honored. At 83, she remained active with the Foundation, traveling to schools and community centers where her personal testimony about the multi-generational impact of heroism consistently moved audiences to tears. The mathematics of heroism are staggering when you really think about them. Eleanor directly saved 237 lives during her service with Operation Nightingale, but the demographic impact of those lives extends far beyond simple addition. Those 237 people had children, who had children, who had children. Conservative estimates suggest that Eleanor's actions during those 3 years of service made possible the existence of over 10,000 people who are alive today.
The statistic always stunned audiences, and I could see people in the crowd trying to process the implications of individual actions rippling across generations. It was one of the most powerful aspects of Eleanor's legacy, the demonstration that single acts of courage could have consequences that extended far beyond anything the heroes themselves could imagine. But numbers, even impressive numbers, don't capture the real significance of Eleanor's legacy. The real significance lies in the understanding that heroism is not a finite resource. Eleanor's courage didn't diminish the world's supply of heroism, it multiplied it. Every person who has been inspired by her example to act with greater courage and compassion has become part of Eleanor's continuing legacy. Maya had seen this multiplication effect repeatedly over the past 5 years. Teachers who incorporated Eleanor's story into their curricula reported that students became more engaged with history and more interested in understanding how individual choices could have historical consequences. Military personnel who studied Operation Nightingale's techniques developed more effective methods for coordinating with local populations during humanitarian operations. Medical professionals who learned about Eleanor's innovations in battlefield medicine applied her improvisational skills to modern emergency situations. 3 years ago, Maya said, moving into the final section of her speech, the Foundation received a letter from a young Marine corporal stationed in Afghanistan. He wrote to tell us that Eleanor's story had inspired him to volunteer for a particularly dangerous mission evacuating civilians from a combat zone. The mission was successful, and 23 Afghan families were relocated to safety. The corporal ended his letter by saying, "I thought about Eleanor Whitfield every mile of that convoy. If a 22-year-old woman could risk everything for strangers in 1918, I could risk everything for strangers in 2019. Maya paused, letting the weight of that contemporary connection sink in. That Marine corporal understood something fundamental about Eleanor's legacy. Her story isn't just history, it's instruction. It's a demonstration that the capacity for extraordinary courage exists within ordinary people, waiting to be activated by the simple decision to care more about other people's welfare than about your own safety. The speech was building towards its conclusion, but Maya wanted to address one final aspect of Eleanor's legacy that had become increasingly important to her over the past 5 years.
When I first discovered Eleanor's hidden documents, Maya said, I thought I was uncovering a forgotten piece of history. I believed my job was to bring Eleanor's story into the light so that she could finally receive the recognition she deserved. And we have accomplished that goal. Eleanor Whitfield is no longer forgotten. Her contributions to American military success are documented and celebrated. Her innovations in intelligence operations are studied in military academies and intelligence training programs. Her courage is honored in memorials, museums, and educational curricula across the country. Maya gestured toward Eleanor's ambulance, which sat behind her like a gleaming monument to courage and sacrifice. But I've learned that recognition was never Eleanor's primary goal. Eleanor spent decades ensuring that her story would be discovered by someone who would understand that the real power of her legacy lay not in celebrating what she had done, but in inspiring others to understand what they could do. The distinction was crucial, and Maya had spent years learning to articulate it effectively. Eleanor's story was powerful not because it described superhuman abilities or impossible circumstances, but because it demonstrated that heroism was achievable by anyone who chose to prioritize other people's welfare over their own comfort and safety. In her final letter to the person who would find her story, Maya said, pulling out the document that had changed her life, Eleanor wrote, "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else is more important than fear." She understood that heroism begins with a choice, not with an ability. Maya looked out at the audience, seeing faces that reflected the full spectrum of American diversity, students and seniors, veterans and civilians, people from every economic and social background who had been drawn together by their recognition that Eleanor's legacy belonged to all of them. Tonight, as we celebrate the opening of this permanent exhibition, I want to leave you with Eleanor's challenge, Maya said. She believed that every person possesses the capacity for extraordinary courage. She believed that heroism is not the exclusive domain of military personnel or emergency responders or public officials. She believed that the most important heroes are often the people who act with courage in circumstances that will never make headlines or earn public recognition. Maya's voice grew stronger as she moved toward her conclusion. Eleanor Whitfield was an ordinary young woman who made extraordinary choices. She was not superhuman, she was not fearless, she was not invulnerable to trauma or immune to doubt. She was a person like you, like me, like everyone in this audience tonight. And if Eleanor could find the courage to risk everything for strangers, if she could persist in doing what was right despite the personal cost, if she could transform an ordinary ambulance into an instrument of hope and salvation, then we can find the courage to make our own extraordinary choices. The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt, but Maya wasn't finished yet. She had one final story to share, one that had only recently come to her attention and that perfectly encapsulated everything Eleanor's legacy had come to represent. 2 weeks ago, Maya said, as the applause faded, I received a package from a high school in rural Montana. Inside was a handwritten note from a 17-year-old student named Sarah, along with a photograph that I want to share with you tonight. Maya moved to the side of the podium where a large screen displayed the photograph she had mentioned. It showed a group of teenagers standing beside a restored 1940s military jeep, all of them wearing expressions of pride and accomplishment. Sarah and her classmates spent 8 months restoring this jeep as part of a history project inspired by Eleanor's story. But they didn't stop with the restoration. They researched the vehicle's history and discovered that it had been used by a unit that provided medical support during the Korean War. They identified the names of the medics who had used the jeep to evacuate wounded soldiers, and they located the families of those medics to share their discoveries. The photograph on the screen changed to show an elderly man in a wheelchair, surrounded by the same group of teenagers, all of them smiling as he examined documents they had preserved and researched. This is Master Sergeant Robert Kim, now 89 years old. For 70 years, he believed that his service in Korea had been forgotten, that the lives he had saved were just statistics in some military database. But Sarah and her classmates proved that his heroism had not been forgotten. They created a permanent display honoring Sergeant Kim and his unit. They arranged for him to speak at their school about his experiences, and most importantly, they demonstrated that Eleanor's legacy of caring about strangers' stories continues to inspire new generations of young people. Maya paused, letting the image of the intergenerational connection sink in. Sarah ended her note to me by writing, Miss Chen, we learned from Eleanor's story that heroes are all around us, but sometimes their stories get lost. We want to make sure that never happens again. The final slide showed Sarah and her classmates presenting their project to a packed auditorium at their school, with Sergeant Kim in the front row and dozens of community members filling the seats behind him. That, Maya said, with her voice filled with emotion, is the true legacy Eleanor Whitfield has finally received. Not the recognition she has received, not the honors that have been bestowed upon her memory, but the understanding that heroism is contagious, that courage inspires courage, and that the stories of extraordinary, ordinary people have the power to transform how we understand our own potential for making a difference in the world. Maya moved back to the center of the podium for her final remarks. Eleanor waited nearly a century for her story to be told. She endured decades of silence, carrying the weight of her extraordinary service without recognition or reward. But she also spent those decades ensuring that when her story finally emerged, it would inspire others to understand that they too possess the capacity for heroism.
Maya's eyes found various faces in the audience: Foundation board members, family descendants, young students, elderly veterans, all connected by their recognition that Eleanor's legacy belonged to them
and that they had a responsibility to carry it forward. As we dedicate this exhibition tonight, we are not simply honoring Eleanor Whitfield's past contributions, Maya concluded. We are accepting her challenge to find our own extraordinary courage, to care about strangers' welfare, to act when action is needed, and to understand that the most important heroism often happens when no one is watching, and no one will ever know what we have sacrificed. Maya stepped back from the podium as the audience rose in sustained applause, but her attention was focused on Eleanor's ambulance, gleaming under the museum's lights like a beacon of hope and possibility. The vehicle that had once carried wounded soldiers to safety now carried Eleanor's message of courage to anyone willing to listen. As the formal program concluded and the reception began, Maya found herself surrounded by people who wanted to share their own connections to Eleanor's story. A young woman from California who had been inspired to become an emergency room physician. A retired teacher who had developed a curriculum about women's contributions to military intelligence. A veteran who had named his daughter Eleanor in honor of the woman whose story had helped him process his own experiences of combat trauma. But it was a conversation with a 12-year-old boy that reminded Maya most powerfully of why Eleanor's story continued to matter. "Miss Chen," the boy said, tugging at her sleeve to get her attention, "my teacher says that heroes are just regular people who make brave choices. Is that really true?" Maya knelt down to the boy's eye level, seeing in his face the same curiosity and potential that Eleanor must have possessed at a similar age. "What do you think?" she asked. The boy considered the question seriously. "I think it's true, because if heroes were special people, then the rest of us couldn't become heroes. But if heroes are regular people, then anyone could be a hero if they wanted to help other people." Maya smiled, recognizing in the child's logic the same understanding that had driven Eleanor's entire approach to heroism. "That's exactly right," she confirmed. Eleanor Whitfield was a regular person who made brave choices. And because she was regular, we know that we can make brave choices too. As the evening wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Maya remained in the exhibition hall, standing beside Eleanor's ambulance and reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them both to this moment. 5 years ago, she had been a young mechanic who thought she was simply fixing an old car. Tonight, she was the curator of a permanent exhibition that would preserve and share Eleanor's legacy for generations to come. But Maya understood that her real accomplishment wasn't the restoration of a vehicle or the creation of a museum display. Her real accomplishment was serving as the bridge between Eleanor's century of silence and the world's need to understand that heroism remained possible, accessible, and necessary. Eleanor Whitfield had risked everything to save strangers because she believed that every life had value and that caring people had a responsibility to act when action was needed. Her story had waited nearly a century to be told, but now it would echo forever. Not just in museums and books, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who understood that the capacity for extraordinary courage lay dormant within ordinary people, waiting to be awakened by the simple recognition that other people's suffering was intolerable. Maya placed her hand on the ambulance's fender one final time, feeling the smooth paint that covered scars earned in the service of saving lives. The vehicle was silent now, its message finally delivered, its purpose finally fulfilled. Eleanor Whitfield's story had been told, her courage had been recognized, and her legacy would continue to inspire new generations of heroes who understood that the world could be changed by anyone who refused to accept that someone else's suffering was inevitable. The echo of Eleanor's courage would continue forever, carried forward by everyone who chose to listen to its message and answer its challenge. In classrooms and hospitals, in military units and civilian communities, in moments of crisis and opportunities for service, people would remember the young woman who risked everything for strangers and find the strength to risk something for strangers of their own. Maya turned off the lights in the exhibition hall, leaving Eleanor's ambulance illuminated by the soft glow of the emergency lighting that would keep it visible to security guards throughout the night. Tomorrow, the museum would open its doors to visitors from around the world, and Eleanor's story would begin its next chapter. No longer hidden, no longer forgotten, but alive and vital, and ready to inspire anyone brave enough to believe that they too possessed the power to change the world. The whispers that had once drawn Maya to the ambulance were silent now, replaced by something far more powerful: the certainty that Eleanor's legacy would continue forever, carried forward by everyone who understood that heroism was not a talent to be discovered, but a choice to be made, over and over again, by ordinary people who refused to let other people's suffering go unanswered. At 29, Maya had evolved into something she never could have imagined during those early days when she first heard Eleanor's ambulance whispering its secrets. She was now Dr. Maya Chen Morrison, having earned her doctorate in American history with a specialization in intelligence operations and women's military service. Her dissertation, The Nightingale Network: How Civilian Volunteers Revolutionized Wartime Intelligence Operations, had become required reading in military academies and intelligence training programs worldwide.
But Maya's proudest achievement wasn't her academic credentials or professional recognition. It was the growing understanding that Eleanor's story had become a catalyst for what historians were beginning to call the New Heroism movement, a cultural shift that was redefining how society understood and celebrated courage in everyday life. The Institute's mission had expanded far beyond preserving Eleanor's individual legacy. It now operated as a comprehensive research center, educational facility, and advocacy organization dedicated to identifying, documenting, and promoting stories of heroism across all cultures, time periods, and circumstances. The Institute's researchers had discovered that heroism followed patterns that transcended national boundaries and historical eras. Patterns that could be taught, learned, and replicated by anyone willing to prioritize others' welfare over their own safety. Maya's husband, Dr. James Morrison, General David Morrison's grandson, and a clinical psychologist specializing in post-traumatic stress disorder, had contributed crucial insights about the psychological dimensions of heroic behavior. His research had demonstrated that heroism often emerged from the same emotional responses that could lead to trauma: intense empathy, hypervigilance to others' suffering, and an inability to ignore injustice or harm. The key difference lay in how individuals channeled those responses toward protective action rather than self-protection. The heroes we study, James often explained in his lectures, aren't people who feel less fear or experience less emotional impact from witnessing suffering. They're people who feel those emotions just as intensely as anyone else, but who choose to transform their emotional response into protective action rather than self-protection. This understanding had revolutionized how the Institute approached heroism education. Rather than treating courage as an innate characteristic that people either possessed or lacked, the Institute's programs taught courage as a skill set that could be developed through practice, support, and gradual exposure to situations that required moral and physical bravery. The results had been extraordinary. Schools that implemented the Institute's Everyday Heroes curriculum reported significant decreases in bullying incidents and increases in bystander intervention when students witnessed harassment or abuse. Medical schools that incorporated Eleanor's story into their training programs found that students developed stronger commitments to treating patients regardless of their ability to pay or social status. Military units that studied Operation Nightingale's techniques showed improved effectiveness in building trust with local populations during humanitarian operations. Maya walked from her office window to the wall of photographs that documented the Institute's impact over the past decade. Hundreds of images showed people whose lives had been changed by exposure to Eleanor's story and the broader understanding of heroism that her legacy had helped develop. There was Dr. Sarah Kim, the teenager from Detroit who had been inspired by Eleanor's story to pursue emergency medicine and who now ran a free clinic in one of the city's most underserved neighborhoods. There was Master Sergeant Jennifer Rodriguez, who had credited Eleanor's example with giving her the courage to report sexual assault in her unit, leading to systemic changes in military culture that had protected countless other service members from similar abuse. There was Michael Chen, no relation to Maya despite the shared surname, a formerly homeless veteran who had discovered Eleanor's story during a visit to the Institute and had subsequently established a nonprofit organization that provided job training and housing assistance to veterans struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. His organization had helped over 2,000 veterans transition successfully to civilian life, and Michael often told people that Eleanor's story had helped him understand that his own traumatic experiences could be transformed into tools for helping others heal. But perhaps the most meaningful photograph on Maya's wall showed a group of refugee children from Syria standing beside Eleanor's ambulance during a visit to the Institute. The children had been brought to America through a resettlement program that had been inspired in part by Eleanor's example of caring for strangers in desperate need. One of the children, a 12-year-old girl named Amira, had written a letter to Maya after the visit. "Miss Maya," Amira had written in careful English, "Eleanor's story makes me understand that even when bad things happen to people, there are always other people who will help. My family lost everything in war, but American people brought us to a safe place because they learned from Eleanor that helping strangers is important. When I grow up, I want to help refugee children like Eleanor helped prisoners in France." Amira's letter had become one of Maya's most treasured possessions, representing the way that Eleanor's 100-year-old courage continued to inspire contemporary acts of compassion that transcended national, cultural, and religious boundaries. The Institute had also become a center for cutting-edge research into the psychology and sociology of heroic behavior. Dr. Rachel Thompson, the Institute's Director of Psychological Research, had spent years studying what she called the heroism ripple effect, the phenomenon by which exposure to heroic examples increased individuals' likelihood of acting courageously in their own lives. We've documented cases where a single heroic act creates cascading effects that can influence hundreds or even thousands of subsequent decisions, Dr. Thompson explained during her presentations to academic conferences. Eleanor Whitfield's story is particularly powerful because it demonstrates heroism that was both extraordinary in its scope and accessible in its methods. People can see themselves in Eleanor's situation and understand that they too could make similar choices.
The ripple effect had been documented extensively through the Institute's longitudinal studies. People who learned about Eleanor's story showed measurably increased rates of volunteer service, charitable giving, and bystander intervention in emergency situations. More significantly, their children showed similar patterns of pro-social behavior, suggesting that exposure to heroic examples could influence not just individual choices, but family cultures across generations. Maya's own daughter Emma represented the third generation to be influenced by Eleanor's legacy. Despite being only 8 years old, Emma had already demonstrated the kind of moral courage that made her parents proud and slightly concerned. She had organized her classmates to stand up to bullies, convinced her school to start a food drive for homeless families, and once walked 2 miles in a snowstorm to check on an elderly neighbor she was worried about. "Mama," Emma had said after her snowy adventure, "Eleanor would have checked on Mrs. Rodriguez too, right? She wouldn't have let an old person be alone and scared during a storm." The matter-of-fact way Emma invoked Eleanor's example demonstrated how naturally heroic thinking could be integrated into a child's moral development. Emma didn't think of her actions as particularly brave or unusual. She thought of them as normal responses to other people's needs, the kind of responses that Eleanor would have expected from anyone who understood their responsibility to care for others. The Institute's work had also attracted international attention, leading to partnerships with organizations around the world that were working to promote understanding of heroism and moral courage. Maya had traveled to Rwanda to study the testimonies of individuals who had protected their neighbors during the 1994 genocide, to Cambodia to document the stories of people who had risked their lives to help others escape the Khmer Rouge, and to Bosnia to interview survivors who had maintained their humanity during ethnic cleansing campaigns. What Maya had discovered was that heroism followed remarkably consistent patterns across cultures and historical contexts. Heroes weren't superhuman individuals with special training or unusual capabilities. They were ordinary people who shared certain psychological characteristics: intense empathy for others' suffering, a sense of personal responsibility for preventing harm, and the ability to act decisively even when the personal risks were severe. Eleanor wasn't unique because she was American, or because she was a woman, or because she lived during World War I, Maya explained during a presentation to the United Nations Human Rights Council. Eleanor was unique because she represents the universal human capacity for extraordinary moral courage. Every culture, every society, every historical period produces individuals who choose to risk everything for strangers. Eleanor's story is powerful because it helps us recognize and cultivate that capacity in ourselves and others. The international recognition had led to the establishment of Eleanor Whitfield Centers in 12 countries, each one dedicated to researching, documenting, and promoting local stories of heroism while connecting those stories to the broader global understanding of moral courage. The centers had documented thousands of previously unknown heroic acts, from the German civilians who had hidden Jewish families during the Holocaust, to the Chinese students who had protected each other during the Cultural Revolution, to the South African anti-apartheid activists who had risked imprisonment and death to challenge racial injustice. But Maya's favorite project remained the Institute's Living Heroes program, which identified and celebrated contemporary individuals whose actions embodied the same principles that had driven Eleanor's wartime service. The program had recognized teachers who had risked their careers to protect immigrant students from deportation, medical workers who had volunteered to treat patients during disease outbreaks, and ordinary citizens who had intervened to prevent crimes or accidents despite significant personal risk. The most recent Living Heroes Award had gone to Maria Santos, a janitor at a Texas elementary school who had noticed signs of abuse in several students and had worked tirelessly to ensure they received protection and support, despite facing threats from the abusive family members and skepticism from some school administrators. Maria's persistence had ultimately led to the rescue of 7 children and the prosecution of their abusers. "I just did what Eleanor would have done," Maria had said during her acceptance speech at the Institute's annual awards ceremony. "I saw children who needed help, and I couldn't pretend I didn't see them." Eleanor teaches us that when you know someone is suffering, you have to act. You can't wait for someone else to care. Maya had tears in her eyes during Maria's speech, recognizing in the janitor's words the same moral clarity that had driven Eleanor's decisions in war-torn France. The connection between past and present heroism was more than historical coincidence. It was evidence of the enduring human capacity for moral courage that transcended time, culture, and circumstance. The Institute had also begun working with technology companies to develop virtual reality experiences that allowed users to experience historical situations requiring moral courage. The Eleanor Whitfield experience used cutting-edge technology to place users in the driver's seat of Eleanor's ambulance during a nighttime rescue mission, forcing them to make split-second decisions about routes, risks, and priorities while experiencing the psychological pressure of operating in enemy territory. Beta testing of the VR experience had shown remarkable results.
Users reported increased empathy for historical figures, greater understanding of the complexity of moral decision-making, and enhanced appreciation for the courage required to act in dangerous situations. More importantly, follow-up studies showed that users were more likely to intervene in real-world situations requiring bystander assistance after experiencing the virtual reality program.
Virtual reality allows us to provide safe practice for moral courage, explained Dr. Kevin Park, the Institute's Director of Technology Innovation. Just as flight simulators allow pilots to practice dangerous maneuvers without real risk, our VR experiences allow people to practice heroic decision-making in controlled environments. The skills and confidence they develop in virtual situations transfer to real-world contexts where courage is needed. The technology program had attracted funding from major tech companies interested in using their resources to promote social good. But Maya remained committed to ensuring that the Institute's work remained accessible to people from all economic backgrounds. Free programs were available to schools, community centers, and nonprofit organizations, while premium experiences helped fund the Institute's broader mission. As Maya continued reviewing the photographs on her office wall, she paused at an image that never failed to move her. A picture of her grandmother Lin Chen, taken just months before her death at age 87, standing beside Eleanor's ambulance and addressing a group of visiting students. "Heroes save lives," Lin was saying in the photograph, her voice still strong despite her advanced age. "But heroes also save futures. Every person Eleanor rescues goes on to have family, to contribute to community, to make world better place. Eleanor's courage creates ripples that continue forever." Lin had passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 years earlier, surrounded by family and secure in the knowledge that her father's story had finally received the recognition it deserved. Her funeral had been attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by Eleanor's legacy, including descendants of Operation Nightingale participants from around the world. But Lin's greatest legacy was her role in helping Maya understand that heroism was not just about individual acts of courage, but about the networks of relationships and mutual support that made heroism possible and sustainable. Eleanor hadn't acted alone. She had been part of a community of resistance fighters, intelligence operatives, and civilian volunteers who had supported each other through the darkest periods of human history. "Heroism is not solitary," Lin had often said during her presentations. "Heroes need other heroes. Eleanor succeeds because she has Jean-Luc and other brave people who share danger and share hope. We remember individual heroes, but we must understand that courage grows best in community." This understanding had led to one of the Institute's most successful programs, the Heroism Support Networks that connected individuals who had acted courageously in their communities and provided ongoing emotional and practical support for their continued service. The networks had become particularly important for whistleblowers, domestic violence advocates, and others whose heroic actions often resulted in personal isolation and professional retaliation. Maya's reflection was interrupted by a knock on her office door. James entered carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had news to share. "Maya, I just got off the phone with the Nobel Committee," he said, his voice carefully controlled but his eyes bright with excitement. Maya felt her heart skip a beat. The Institute had been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 3 times over the past 5 years, recognizing its work in promoting international understanding of moral courage and its role in preventing conflicts through education and advocacy. But Maya had never allowed herself to believe that Eleanor's story could reach such heights of global recognition. "And?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James broke into a smile that transformed his entire face. "The Eleanor Whitfield Institute for Heroic Studies has been awarded the 2034 Nobel Peace Prize for its contributions to preventing violence and promoting human dignity through education in moral courage."
Maya sat down heavily in her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what James had just told her. The Nobel Peace Prize represented the highest form of international recognition for efforts to make the world more peaceful and just. Eleanor's story had traveled from a hidden compartment in a forgotten ambulance to the pinnacle of global acknowledgement. "There's more," James continued. "The committee specifically cited the Institute's work in conflict prevention, noting that communities with access to our heroism education programs show significantly lower rates of violence, discrimination, and human rights violations. They said that Eleanor's story has become a universal symbol of hope and human dignity." Maya thought about Eleanor, the 22-year-old woman who drove through enemy territory to save strangers, carrying trauma that would haunt her for the rest of her life, never knowing that her courage would one day be recognized at the highest levels of international achievement. She thought about Lin Chen, who had lived long enough to see her father's heroism honored, but not long enough to see Eleanor's story reach this extraordinary recognition. "Eleanor would be amazed," Maya said finally. "A farm girl from Vermont, traumatized and forgotten for 70 years, whose story becomes the foundation for a Nobel Peace Prize." James sat down across from Maya's desk, his expression growing more serious. "But Eleanor would also understand that this recognition isn't really about her individual story. It's about what her story has inspired, the thousands of people who have chosen courage because they learned that courage was possible, the communities that have become more just because they understood their responsibility to protect vulnerable members, the international cooperation that has emerged from shared commitment to heroic principles."
Maya nodded, understanding that James was right. The Nobel Prize was recognition not just of Eleanor's wartime heroism, but of the extraordinary network of courage that had grown from her example over the past 15 years. The award ceremony would take place in Oslo in December, and Maya knew that she would be thinking of everyone whose life had been touched by Eleanor's legacy. The students who had learned to stand up to bullies, the medical professionals who had committed to serving underserved populations, the civilians who had intervened to prevent violence, and the countless others who had chosen to transform their empathy into protective action. But Maya also knew that Eleanor's greatest satisfaction would come not from the prestigious recognition, but from the knowledge that her century of silence had finally been transformed into a voice that would echo forever, inspiring new generations of heroes who understood that the world could be changed by ordinary people who refused to accept that someone else's suffering was inevitable. As Maya and James prepared to share the news with their colleagues and begin planning for the extraordinary responsibilities that would come with Nobel recognition, Maya paused at her office window once more. Emma was still playing in the courtyard below, now organizing her friends into what appeared to be a rescue game inspired by Eleanor's ambulance adventures. Maya smiled, recognizing in her daughter's natural leadership and protective instincts the fourth generation to be influenced by Eleanor's legacy. Emma represented the future of heroism, a generation that would grow up understanding that moral courage was not exceptional, but expected, not superhuman, but accessible to anyone who chose to prioritize others' welfare over their own comfort. The whispers that had first drawn Maya to Eleanor's ambulance had been transformed into a roar of recognition that would echo across generations, ensuring that Eleanor Whitfield's courage would continue to inspire new heroes long after everyone who had known her story personally had passed into their own place in history. The legacy was complete, but it was also just beginning. Eleanor's story had proven that heroism was not a finite resource, but a renewable energy that multiplied with each person who chose to listen to its call and answer its challenge. The Nobel Peace Prize was not an ending, but a beginning, a recognition that the world had finally understood what Eleanor had known all along, that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power to change the world, one act of courage at a time. Maya stood one final time beside Eleanor's ambulance, now permanently displayed in the Nobel Peace Prize Museum in Oslo, its brass nameplate reading, "Eleanor Whitfield's Ambulance, Symbol of Ordinary Courage, Extraordinary Impact." Visitors from around the world came daily to touch its weathered fenders and hear the story of a young woman who had refused to let strangers suffer alone. The ambulance no longer whispered, it sang. It sang of courage that echoed across generations, of love that transcended time, and of the unbreakable truth that every person carries within them the power to be someone else's hero. Eleanor's century of silence had become an eternal voice calling to anyone brave enough to believe that they too could change the world. As Maya watched a group of children gather around the ambulance, their eyes bright with possibility, she knew that Eleanor's greatest victory was not the recognition she had finally received, but the understanding she had given to the world, that heroes are not born, they are chosen. Chosen by circumstances that demand courage, chosen by strangers who need protection, and chosen by their own hearts that refuse to turn away from suffering. Eleanor Whitfield had waited a century to tell her story. Now, through the voices of everyone she had inspired, she would tell it forever. The mechanic girl had revealed the W11 ambulance's secret story, and that discovery had indeed left experts speechless. Speechless with wonder at the extraordinary courage that lives within ordinary hearts, waiting to be awakened by the simple recognition that someone, somewhere, needs our help. In the end, Eleanor's whisper had become the world's roar. Heroes are everywhere. Heroes are possible. Heroes are you. If you enjoyed this epic story of courage, discovery, and the power of hidden heroes, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true story adaptations that will inspire and amaze you. Turn on the bell icon to never miss our latest stories of extraordinary people who changed the world through ordinary acts of heroism. Thank you for joining us on Maya and Eleanor's incredible journey. Remember, every hero's story starts with a choice to care about someone else's suffering. What will your story be? Subscribe now and be part of our community celebrating the heroes among us.